Michael, thank you so much for being here. You have such a great background, but I'm so curious, how did you get from being a chemistry major to becoming a university president? How do those two things sort of match to one another?
So it's an interesting journey. I often deem myself a sort of accidental administrator, in that I don't know that I would have put that on my resume of, or my aspirational list of a 20-year plan. But it all started for me. Actually, I came and rejoined the faculty here at Fairleigh Dickinson after I was an undergraduate student here. I actually, interestingly, took over the job of my undergraduate research advisor and stepped into a role and loved teaching. I loved the aspects of being in the classroom and in many cases, particularly educating freshmen or first year students. It was just a fun time to see that transition of students coming to the university and getting comfortable. So I thought that was what I wanted to do. I thought that was what I was going to be passionate about and what I was going to love to do. And the problem became, all of a sudden nobody wanted to be department chair, and so I said, all right, I guess I'll do it. And I took on that role after probably about 3 or 4 years at the university. It was an interesting dynamic as well, because I was actually department chair in a department that had some colleagues who were formerly my professors. So there was an interesting layered
Oh, wow.
level of camaraderie there. And then in 2008, the then president of the university said, we're considering starting a pharmacy school. You seem to be sort of the closest alignment, because we had a department of pharmaceutical science alongside chemistry. What do you think? And I said, I don't know. I'll get back to you. And then next thing I knew, I was on a 4-year journey to build a pharmacy school here at the university that led me to becoming the dean of that school. And then for the next decade there or thereabouts, I then was building all of our health science programs. So we added a physician assistant program, social work, occupational therapy, and it just became sort of a passion of mine to continue sort of administering and building. And then stepped into a role of university provost when that role opened up, and thought I'd be doing that for a while. And then 1 year later, ended up as university president. So it was a kind of very interesting journey with a lot of lessons learned, and I think in many cases a lot of really good practice along the way.
That's absolutely incredible just to hear that journey of, going from faculty member to department chair to leading the pharmacy school and then stepping into the provost role. How have your relationships changed as you've sort of taken on these different sort of roles and had new scale? And also, how has your perspective on leadership evolved as you've sort of stepped up those different ranks?
It's been interesting because, again, my relationship goes back in some cases to a student faculty relationship at a time when I was a student here. So it's really been a dynamic journey. But one of the things that you notice, and it's actually interesting, I just wrote a post on this the other day. When you become an administrator in higher education, things change for you largely because people sort of view you in some sort of a different role of, I don't want to call it adversarial, but in some ways, sort of a kind of an on the other side, I would just say. And so, becoming an administrator, you're really trying to navigate a lot of the relationships that you had, and try and navigate them in a way where they're different, but you want to preserve, hopefully, if you can, the sort of interpersonal aspects. And so, I think one of the things that I think benefited greatly from is, because I've been at the university for 20 years. I've built a lot of relationships with people along the way. I hope all of them have been beneficial for both, but I know most have been very beneficial for me. And it allows you to know people, it allows you to know their story, it allows you to know their journey, and it also allows you to sort of build a level of trust. And I think, as president now, particularly in a challenging time in higher education, it allows me to be able to speak with a boldness and an honesty that doesn't come across as, this guy's just saying this, or he's new to the place, he doesn't understand us. And I think that has been tremendously helpful, because it gives me a level of credibility as I'm saying things that don't just come as either distrustful because we don't know you, or somewhat hollow because you don't know us. And I think it helps for me to be able to manage a lot of the interpersonal and even some of the difficult conversations that we've had to have, and I know we'll continue to have as higher ed continues to evolve.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And having those deep relationships and being able to create that psychological safety just seems like a big competitive edge for you to sort of step in, to, authentically lead and do it from a place of sort of interpersonal awareness. Um, how do you think about this challenge of like shared governance with innovation? And how do you think about the sort of the tenuous balance between the two? Because what I'm hearing is like, wow, you've all sort of completely repositioned your institution. You've grown so many different departments. You've really done a good job, I think, on the sort of enrollment side of finding needs and market niches and everything like that and positioning it. How do you sort of balance that piece of it with, the really sort of traditional shared governance model?
It's probably the biggest challenge in higher education, right? The two concepts are almost diametrically opposed at times, right? And I think, I in no way want to downplay the importance of shared governance because we're seeing glimmers of in some places right now what happens when academic freedom is questioned or when there's challenges and pushback, right? So it's a real thing, but there is a problem in that it's in many cases it precludes us from really being able to be innovative and really being able to pivot and change in a time that's necessary when the world around us is so rapidly shifting in dynamically changing. And I think it's one of the things that, we've quickly learned in higher education that the whole mindset of the academy being an unchanged and sort of well preserved entity when the rest of the world evolves around it was probably a legitimate thing up until a certain point more recently. And now we're just seeing it no longer is real, right? That the things we want to hold dear to, which in many cases are very important traditions and very important and grounding pieces of what higher education are, force us into a business model that is crumbling, right? And ultimately you're seeing, and I just saw a statistic this morning on, I think, the number of closures of institutions this past year, and the numbers are staggering, and that continues to grow and continues to be a concern. We realize more and more that the problem comes from an unsustainable business model that's built for a day that no longer exists, right? And I think we have to wrap our heads around how do we preserve the importance of things like shared governance and academic freedom and those things, but remind ourselves that shared governance was never an assurance that the institution didn't need to change, that the institution didn't need to evolve. And in some cases, as we see such rapid shifts with AI and other sorts of things, that we're going to get left far behind if we're holding dear to things that just can't exist in that same way.
Completely, completely. And how do you get your teams on board with that message, and get your faculty sort of on board with that message, right? Because it's such a tricky balance between the two. We've got this institutional culture and we have these academic freedoms that are so necessary and so core to our mission as an institution. But at the same time, we have real organizational challenges and things that are happening outside of the academy that are sort of threatening the existence within it. How do you think about that sort of tenuous space between the two and getting people on board to really sort of change?
I think the thing that I think getting back to a prior question, a lot of it is trust and relationship, right? That I've found that the tact I've taken, and it's probably a luxury of being able to step into a new role, but having familiarity on both directions, it creates this opportunity for me to be sort of bluntly honest, right? To talk about the challenges and just state them, and to be open about if people have different solutions. I'm all ears, right? I used to actually say that back in the days when we were starting a pharmacy school. I'm not a pharmacist by training. I said, I'm not married to this thing because it's my life. I believe it's a good idea and a good opportunity. If someone else has a better idea, but we'll do yours instead, right? And I think similarly in this vein, I want to talk and engage in dialogue where it's not just all my ideas and it's not just we have to do this because I said so, but I do think that it's providing an honest forum for real, blunt, and honest conversations, right? To talk about here's the realities of the business model in higher education, but for probably 100 or so elite institutions that can ground themselves with deep endowments and deep, a very competitive enrollment. Everyone else is in need of an assessment of the reality that the balance sheet can never work using this model, right? What we've seen over and over in the conversations you have with anyone in the public is people are maxed out at how much they are willing and able to pay for a college education. So going on the revenue side to say, okay, we're going to make more money by raising tuition is no longer a strategy and not a viable one, and frankly should probably never have been one to begin with. Saying we're going to use the state to provide us more resources is probably a fool's errand. Most states are not dumping more and more money into higher education. Saying we're going to find more and more students at a time where students are continuing to not select college and that there are less of them coming to college because of demographic shifts, that's not a viable one either. So when you start to lay out these challenges, we have to look and honestly assess that the business model will fail if we continue to see the costs rise to deliver the product and the services and the quality, and the revenues fail. So we have to start talking about that reality. And I think that's one of the things I've just tried to lay out with the faculty and with just the entire community here is, let's talk open and honest about those are our challenges. And if we take on and acknowledge and all agree that those are the challenges, we may not agree on the solutions, but we do agree that staying the course status quo isn't a solution.
That's incredibly well said. So many layers to simply to put it. Kind of a follow up there. When you think about that tenuous balance of delivering the great products, right? That great education, the things that are getting them job ready, and able to sort of step in and be a difference maker, the impact, all those things that you really sort of to your core mission. How do you think about that balance with the operational cost piece and what the two? Because that feels like such a tricky space that I know so many leaders that really struggle.
It's such a push and pull because you essentially on a college campus are providing the resources of a city, right? I always use the analogy: you've got restaurants or dining, you've got security and public safety and police, and you've got resources for counseling and support and health and other things, all of which are continuing to rise in cost. And frankly, students are continuing to expect greater service from and having greater needs for. And so providing a high quality experience is in some cases antithetical to being able to operate within the budgetary constraints, right? And so this is the greatest challenge I think we face, which is that we want to provide an experience for our students to succeed. We owe it to them. That's the fundamental mission of any academic institution, and certainly ours. But the challenge becomes that each year it becomes harder and harder to do that, because the traditional environment would be to continue to inflate costs to cover those costs. But there's a point where that just can't happen anymore. People can't and won't pay it. And so this is really the dynamic of, I think, this sort of sentinel challenge of higher education, because we're seeing it now in all of the things going on with regard to the realities of the student needs versus the realities of the deliverable that we can provide. And the fact is, we have to strike a balance, but we have to do so while not bankrupting ourselves, right? And I think there are creative ways to do that. The thing I've talked about with great regularity, there needs to be greater partnership, right? Greater partnership amongst institutions and the surrounding communities, the ability to be able to share services, the ability to be able to in some way think about kind of building systems, I think is a healthy way to think of it. And the analogy I always use is what has happened in healthcare, right? That there was a point in time when I was starting our pharmacy school where I would go to the leaders of 15 different hospitals in the area, and each one was a different leader and each system was a different system. And through consolidation and through this sort of space of creating systems, they did that largely to be able to scale and provide services within their budget. And they did so by now, all of a sudden, instead of me going to 15 CEOs, there were only 3, right, with 3 major systems. And that change, I think, is something that may not look exactly the same in higher ed, but unless we can gain efficiencies, we're going to struggle to continue to provide the services students demand and students need.
And when it comes to that approach, you're trying to sort of like forecast 5 years out, 10 years out, think about where you want your institution, how do you sort of balance the two? How do you think about leveraging data and leveraging technology to really sort of meet those aims?
I think one of the big pieces we need to understand, and I think it's one of the gaps, frankly, that higher ed has, is who's in our classroom, who's selecting us, why are they selecting us, right? And I think we fooled ourselves into believing the answer we want to hear, right? Everybody selects us because we have such a strong program in X or because we have this thing. I think it's probably not the case. I always use the analogy that, I remember teaching, non-major courses in chemistry when I was a faculty member there. And, I wanted to believe they all selected because I had such profound things to offer about, chemistry for the global citizen, right? And the reality was most of them probably selected it because they needed 4 credits and the time was 11 a.m. and they had an open point in their schedule and they said, this looks fine, right? And I think understanding more about students and what they want and need helps us to provide better for them. And using data to drive that helps us to be much more analytical in decision making, even in how we leverage our tuition models, how we leverage our recruitment strategies, right? Who it is that's likely to come to FDU is probably a subset of who we want to believe it is, right? We want to believe there are, all of these audiences across all 50 states. And the reality is that there may be a subset in a certain area, but the likelihood is they want a certain thing from us. So being able to sort of focus our targeting will help us to be more efficient. It'll help us to get people who will thrive and succeed here. And it'll help us, frankly, to manage our costs in doing that. So I think that's a big portion of where we need to begin thinking much more analytically and much more, frankly, like a business, because the business world has been doing this for many years and doing it quite successfully.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's I think it's both thinking analytically and it's kind of something you said, being really customer centric in that. What are
Yes.
the needs that they have from us, and how are we sort of driving this in a way that's really sort of meeting those needs, and then sort of taking and positioning our offerings to sort of gap fill, which is a really smart way of doing it. Which brings me to another question, right? A lot of people talk about, the demographic cliff that's coming, along with the shifts that sort of happen. Nathan Brown's work, I think, is like really works super well. I think a conversation I've heard less in circles is how the breadth of competition has really changed, right? It's like you're not just competing against the similar schools to an FDU, but you're competing against not just community colleges and state colleges and national institutions and all of this other stuff. You're competing against with like online creators. You're competing against these low priced offerings that aren't higher education, but could have some kind of demand signaling or appeal to other aspects of to what your target audience is really sort of looking for. So with all of that said, and everything that you just shared regarding, data and those positions, how do you think about positioning FDU in just such a like crazy crowded landscape, and really like doing it in a way that lets your competitive advantages come to the forefront?
I think the fundamental core of doing this and doing it in a way that you can win at is you have to be willing to understand and acknowledge that you can't be everything to everyone, right? I think the biggest mistake higher ed has made is it has believed that every institution has a mission to serve every student, right? And there are certain institutions where that should be the mission, right? A community college should have a breadth of offerings to provide to students as an option to help them to navigate and get a foot in the door in higher education at an affordable price point. A state institution should have a mission of a much wider focus of offerings and areas of study because it's being subsidized by the state that's its mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've made this mistake and we've said that has to be every institution's mission. Every institution has to have 150 majors to select from. It has to have all of this different programming. It has to have all of these services. We need to be willing and confident to say we want to build an identity where we do some things, but we do them with excellence. And if you want those things, they are things that you can get here and that you will succeed in and that you will leave happy from, right? And I think I use the example of the health sciences and the things we built. That was a strategic decision that the university made to go to an area that we had strength in. We've had a school of nursing for over 75 years. We've had psychology and counseling programs. We added all these others as a complementarity, largely because we had a legacy of doing it. but also because we saw the signs of the times that there were going to be greater opportunities for careers in these areas that were high earning, that created opportunity, that filled need societally. And that's part of our mission. I think we have to be willing to say not anything about what we believe is good or bad, but what we're good at, right? I think that the mindset shift is if we say we no longer want to be in a certain space, it's not an editorial on believing it doesn't have value. It's us believing that there are other places that do it well and we want to be able to support them, right? And I think that's the thing that higher ed hasn't had the courage to do is to create greater focus. And the analogy I always use is that, in the world of sales and shopping, if you will, right? Opening a Walmart and a Target across the street from one another, where both things sell all of these, then ultimately the only thing you can do in that marketplace is to compete on price, right? Because you want to go and it's cheaper here or it's cheaper there. There is a world where boutiques survive next to a Walmart or next to a Target that focus on a different clientele, focus on a different product set. Sometimes it's different quality, sometimes it's customer service, but both are able to coexist in a way because one is not playing to the other, right? And they're completely different. And if you want one thing, you go to there. And if you want the other, you go to there. And I think we need to think about this sort of differentiated product mindset. And again, not in any way editorializing what we think is valuable or not, but frankly, what we're good at and what students will benefit from us providing for them.
That's incredibly well said. Differentiated. So how did you really come to terms with like what the true strengths were and do it in a way where you've got like a degree of confidence in it? Can you walk me through the steps that you all sort of took to really sort of like win with that? Because I feel like that's so key and so important and something that so many places struggle with. They're trying to be all things to all people and they fall short. You guys, I think, have done a really good job of finding your strengths, positioning them. And I think that comes through in the web copy. What did that process really sort of look like in terms of really sort of bringing those to the forefront?
Part of it, I think, stems from understanding your audience, right? Understanding who our students are, right? And more than just who they are, what's the story that they bring to us, right? And I always use the example, we have, and we're very proud of the fact that we're a Hispanic serving institution, right? So we have a substantial number of students coming from the communities surrounding us. And for many of the students, we also have a substantial number of first generation students. Many on our metropolitan campus are commuters and they're navigating, I always say, life, right? That higher education is one part of a life that's more complicated than this is what you do for 4 years. Understanding that and a student that's selecting us with some of those things that they bring to us, we also understand what those students are likely looking for, right? They're looking for opportunities in professionally focused fields that create an opportunity for them and for their family unit to gain upward mobility, right? And that is not to say in any way that they're going to say every student's going to do X or every student's going to do Y, but that the types of selection that they're making and the needs that they have on campus and the things they're looking for align not just with their 4-year experience, but with their entire life, right? And I think I always say that's, I think, a wonderful story we tell is that the impact that institutions like ours have isn't just on the student. It's on multiple generations, right? It's on the student. It's on, in many cases, their children or others in their family unit that they either have or will have. And then it's on parents and other extended family because they are the sort of shining star to bring this upward mobility to the family unit intergenerationally. And I think when you realize that that's the case, it helps you to hone in on what would that type of student, that student who comes with those needs, want from us in terms of the programming, in terms of the services, in terms of co-curricular and extracurricular supports, and most importantly, for a student that is looking for that as sort of their horizon, the career focus on some sort of an opportunity that brings them a career that earns and gives them this upward mobility.
Yeah, incredibly well said. And I think again that customer orientation, customer focus, I think really sort of being a strong differentiator, and part of the reason that you're continuing to be ranked so high in those value indicators. Um, One thing I'm just kind of curious about with all the different things that are sort of converging on education right now, and all the different sort of like internal dynamics and market forces and all these pieces, where do you personally feel like the biggest pinch as a college president?
I think it's really fundamentally needing to create dynamic and transformational change in an environment that is often risk averse and change averse, right? In any other world, in any other industry, change is the normal, and turnarounds, if you will, right? Or the kind of rehashing of the business plan are a part of any typical corporation. In this world, it's almost sort of taboo, right? And I think that becomes, as a leader, this great challenge, because you have all of these external market forces that are pulling you in a direction where you need to do something different, because you just fundamentally know that either the numbers don't work now, or even if they work now, there's a point in time where they no longer work. And you've got a community that has really stayed and true to a mindset of this is what we are about, what we've always been about, and what we should always be about. And that sort of tug of war between those two conflicting views, I think, is the greatest challenge as a leader, because you don't want to just simply say, we're doing this, and whether you want it or not, this is what you're going to get. Because part of the leadership role, particularly in higher ed, is building consensus to get people to buy in, so that people are coming along for the journey, and that you're frankly able to deliver the important things you need to deliver. But an unwillingness to do those things can bankrupt you, right? And so there's this, I think, dynamic as a leader, that you have to be acknowledging both sides, but the side that is going to win is the side of economics if something isn't drastically done differently. And I think that is the complexity.
Yeah, that is a massive complexity, and that tension between the two, kind of like we talked about the shared governance and all those different pieces, is a really sort of tricky one, I think, to really sort of get at. If you could wave a magic wand and just like fix one thing operationally, right? Like just like almost sort of outsource something and just have something sort of an easy button sort of fix, where's your head go of for like, wow, this would be a difference maker for FDU?
I think the biggest thing for us is if we were able to create an affordability resource that allowed our students to be less burdened with debt, and with that sort of last dollar concern of, can I make this work? I think it would change everything for us, because it would provide really a focus on the students coming to us and staying because they can, frankly. So much of what you hear on any college campus is that for every student that stops out because they don't want to be in college anymore, or because they didn't want to go to class, or whatever that is, many more of our students are stopping out, or are challenged to the point where they have to stop out by the financial aspects, right? And I think taking that burden off of our students then frees us up to create an environment where the focus is on creating this dynamic environment where students can learn and grow and thrive, and not on how do we do things in such a way where the student can afford it and we can afford it and all those other things. So I think that would be, to me, the game changer. And you've seen this in institutions that have gone, to a point where they've been able to resource through a large endowment a tuition-free mindset, right? I know Princeton did that, and they were one of the first, and some of the others have followed. And that sort of takes the burden off of any student making a decision on anything other than, is that a place where I feel I belong, right? And that, to me, creates a dynamic where then you have the opportunity to really do some special things.
Completely, completely. Well said. Well, maybe a fun question to wrap it on. Like, what are you excited about? Right? With there's all these challenges in the space. There's so much that's happening with these market forces. But where do you personally get really, really excited for the years ahead?
The thing has always been my favorite part of the job, and frankly, in some cases, has been atypical probably from my journey relative to the journey of most other people in higher ed leadership, is I've had the opportunity to be a builder. We've created all these new programs, and it's terribly labor intensive and terribly complicated and at times terribly burdensome. But it's really like nothing else, right? Getting to create something in our pharmacy school or our other programs where we wrote things down on paper and 4 years later actually saw them in 3 dimensions when the first class showed up is really so unique and such a really neat experience. I think the thing that excites me is that in the challenges of the times are going to require us to be innovative and to really rethink and reimagine and rebuild at a time where, frankly, but for the circumstances that higher ed finds itself in, that would probably never happen. So, for all of the burdens and the things that you carry as a result of the headaches that come with being in this very challenged environment and this very challenged business model, comes the opportunity for really some outside the box thinking and some opportunities, I think, to be able to transform the business model, to transform the structure, and in some cases to transform, frankly, just how we operate. And I think to me, that's the most exciting point at the sort of thinking about the next 5 years is how do we redefine what higher education is, but more importantly, how do we redefine what higher education can be? And I think to me, that's the thing that gets me up and early in the morning, starting to think about, all right, let's kind of use the thought experiment of where do we go today?
Yeah. Incredibly well said. Thank you so much for the insight. This has been absolutely incredible. To use in great hands, and
Happy to talk with you. Great questions and always fun to talk about it.
Definitely. I'm just going to hit stop.